Hello there, Blogging Heads audience. Glenn Loury back again, The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, sponsored by the Watson Institute for Public and International Affairs at Brown University. And I am here with my friend, I think I can call her that, Amy Wax, Professor of Law. You have a chair, Amy. Maybe you can tell people what the name of it is at the University of Pennsylvania.
The Robert Mundheim Professor of Law.
There you are.
Our former dean,
Professor.
Robert Mundheim.
Amy Wax, and we've had a number of conversations here at Blogging Heads. I'm glad to welcome you back to the Glenn Show, Amy.
Glad to be here.
So here we are, by my reckoning, a little bit later this morning on the East Coast of the United States. I happen to be in the south of France at the moment. That's not keeping us from talking.
Poor dear.
This morning, the United States Senate Judiciary Committee is going to open a hearing on the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh, or an amended meeting of the committee's hearing process on his nomination, attended to a number of allegations about his misbehavior on the sexual front that have been circulating of late. Everybody within earshot of us knows what I'm talking about, and I definitely want to get your reactions as a legal scholar and an observer of American politics about what's going on. That one being, once you start talking about it, you never get out. I thought the first thing I might do, availing our audience of your expertise, is to ask you your reactions to this very important case that's coming to trial, in which Harvard University is defending itself against a consortium of Asian American students, alleging that the students are being discriminated against because of their race in the admissions process at Harvard. So those are my two agenda items for us to kick around here, Amy. And let me again just ask you. I'm not a lawyer. I do have some passing acquaintance with the jurisprudence on affirmative action. I've been writing about affirmative action for many years. But I'm wondering what the legal landscape is against the backdrop. That's the backdrop for this case. What's at stake in terms of court precedent, where this case might go, and what you see as the fundamental issues that are at stake in the lawsuit that's coming forward on affirmative action. So could you talk about that for a bit?
Well, yeah, it's actually rather complicated because there's a lot going on in this case. The basic allegation of this Asian American students organization is that Harvard University, and of course it's not just Harvard, but the whole Ivy League and other places, discriminates against them on the basis of race, notices their race, makes decisions on the basis of their race, favors other students over them, including white students and black students with similar credentials, and that this is unlawful and impermissible under the Supreme Court's line of cases about affirmative action. And the evidence on which they base this is that Harvard has kept fairly steady the percentage of Asian students. It looks almost like there's a formula or a quota, and that's relevant. Even though the percentage of Asians who have applied has increased and their credentials, at least in terms of academic credentials and numbers, are outstanding, and that they admit other students from other groups with much lesser credentials. So they say that this is all smoking gun stuff to indicate that there is a use of race and an excessive use of race, right? So excessive is key because the Supreme Court has not completely ruled out the use of race. Now, what's the legal background here against which they're making these allegations? A series of cases going all the way back to the 60s and 70s on race-conscious selection processes, not just in education, but for government contracts, for jobs, and the like, what we come to call affirmative action, putting especially blacks ahead of others in order to get these positions. But the particular line of cases that's relevant here is in education. So initially, there were affirmative action programs across a wide variety of spheres in which private organizations and government entities would say, well, given past discrimination in our society, we're going to put a thumb on the scale for blacks. Very early on, the Supreme Court kind of put threw cold water on that. Why did they do that? Because they said the use of race is forbidden by the Constitution or by our statutes, except as a remedy. This all plugs into this body of remediation law, which is ancient and many hundreds of years old. And there are certain strict rules about the use of race as a remedy that go to remediation law. You have to identify the culprit. You have to show that they're at fault. You have to direct the remedy to the wrongdoer. You can't affect other people. You can't extract favors from people that haven't been shown to do wrongs. And very important, it is not legitimate simply to use race to remedy vague societal discrimination. Vague societal discrimination, right? So that created a lot of problems for public universities that had never been shown to discriminate before on the basis of race. There was very little proof that they had. A lot of northern universities, for example, but they wanted more blacks. The big sea change came in the Bakke case. The Bakke case was decided in the 1970s. It was a case out of California. Some white guy said that he was not admitted to medical school because blacks were favored over him. The Supreme Court basically agreed, but Justice Powell wrote a very influential decision in that case in which he said, well, remediation may not be a valid basis for affirmative action, but diversity of the student body may be a valid basis for affirmative action. There may be pedagogical value to creating a diverse class that reflects the demography of society as a whole. Well, even though that diversity rationale was a throwaway in Bakke, it came back with a vengeance in future cases, especially the Grutter case involving University of Michigan Law School several decades later. Of course, there was a lot of percolation in the lower courts, where the Supreme Court embraced it overtly and said, we hereby recognize that the pedagogical priority of diversity may represent the kind of compelling interest that would justify the use of race in selecting students, as long as it's narrowly tailored to accomplish the purpose, right? Doesn't use quotas and doesn't go any further than necessary to accomplish this pedagogical goal. And that was a Justice O'Connor opinion in Grutter, very influential. Now, she did say, a few important things there. She once again dumped on the idea of quotas. She also said we accord great expertise to educational experts. They're the ones who know how much diversity we need. Talked a little bit about a critical mass, all sorts of, psychologizing about race and diversity and pedagogy and stuff. This set the stage for every case that came after.
Now, let me just stop you right there for a minute. This is 2002. Do I get that correct?
I think it's 2005. It's in the mid-2000s sometime. I forget. She
also said that she, as I recall, that she reckoned that we wouldn't be in the same position in need of a special dispensation for disadvantaged racial minority students applying to elite campuses in 25 years, didn't she?
She did.
Although I don't know if there's any legal constraint that's implied by that speculation on her part.
Well, that was a weird statement, actually, because it represents a kind of residua from the remedial paradigm, right? The remedial paradigm has always had sunsetting type desiderata. So, for example, school desegregation. Well, this isn't going to last forever. Busing won't last forever. Our remedial rectification of past discrimination can't last forever. Why? Because if it's an effective remedy, and it really returns the victim to their rightful position, it ought to work, and it ought to work after a while. If it goes on in perpetuity, it shows that it's not the proper remedy. Well, she imports that thinking into the diversity rationale. I mean, why shouldn't the requirement for diversity, for jiggering with diversity, go on forever? Frankly, I don't see why not. So there's a certain way in which the 25-year statement doesn't really fit with the diversity rationale, and it has been criticized, right? It has been criticized for that purpose.
Actually, that's a nice point. If diversity is indeed a compelling interest, it doesn't stop being compelling after 25 years.
Bill, but here's the counter argument. The counter argument is, why do we need affirmative action? Let's be very frank about it, Glenn. Because blacks lag educationally. If they caught up and their profile reflected that of other groups in terms of the variation in their academic prowess, right? They ran the gamut like everybody else. We had overlapping bell curves. We wouldn't need affirmative action anymore to achieve diversity, right? We just have the best and the brightest from every group. So there is a kernel of hopeful truth there that we will reach a point in society where blacks will catch up, but we don't know whether that will happen or not.
Okay, let me stop you again. Here's what I can imagine someone who's defending affirmative action might say. They might say, and I think of William Bowen, the late William Bowen, former president of Princeton University, president of the Mellon Foundation. I think of Derek Bach, former president of Harvard University. These are two great leaders of American higher education, the second half of the 20th century. They put out a book, as you know, gosh, it's been 20 years now, called The Shape of the River,
right?
In which they used the data that Bowen had overseen the collection of at the Mellon Foundation in order to study the consequences at 24 or so selective universities and liberal arts colleges of the use of racial affirmative action, racial preferences at those places. And the bottom line, I'm summarizing a long argument. It's a 400-page book with lots of appendices and footnotes. But the bottom line is, we are supervising the creation of elite cadres of Americans. They're going to go on to run the law firms and then populate the professions and go into politics and go into businesses and such like that. They're going to be the leaders of the future, the people who come through Princeton and Harvard and other such institutions. It's essential. It's not a pedagogic. They don't so much make the pedagogic argument, it seems to me, as they make the argument I'm making right now. It's essential for the stability and the health of American society, given our history, that those elites not be devoid of representatives of these disadvantaged minority groups. I speak now of blacks and Latinos, just for the sake of the health of the country. It's very important that those elites be integrated. All we're doing, they say, is ensuring that that goal of producing elites that are racially integrated is met as best we can through the stewardship that we exercise over our respective institutions. And we've looked at the data, and while you're right, the minority students, the black and the Latino students, are entering with lower scores. And that's not without consequence, but those consequences are not major. At places like Princeton and Harvard, they're graduating at very high rates. And indeed, they are going on. They have longitudinal data on a sample of students. They can watch them for 10 years after leaving their institutions to careers of successful careers in these various areas. So we're achieving our goal. And we're achieving it at relatively minimal cost. Although we are disadvantaging some students at the margin from the groups that are not protected, those students' lives are not ruined by the fact that they didn't get into Princeton or Harvard. So can we not be pragmatic here, they say, and allow these elite institutions the latitude to administer over their portal, which is the entryway into American leadership, in a manner that actually furthers the health of society. Now, I don't know what a court would say about that, but I'm curious what you would say.
Well, first of all, I think that argument certainly had an influence on the Supreme Court in Grutter, no question, because there was a very influential brief from the military signed by a bunch of generals that everybody believes had got a lot of attention from O'Connor, that's essentially made that argument, right? We need, in order to have an effective military, we have to include all of these different groups in leadership positions and in all sorts of positions, and that's really a compelling interest. It's not that there are no downsides, but the upside is so great. Now, I think that argument has a lot of weight. It's very appealing, but I think what it does is that it ignores a lot of downsides that people don't want to think about, right? First of all, we're not just talking about Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Ironically, affirmative action is the least egregious in these top schools because they get the pick of the litter, right? The gaps between the groups are the smallest in a way in those institutions. As we go down the pecking order, though, we're really seeing some enormous discrepancies and disparities, including, and this got me in trouble when I said it initially, people who probably should not be pursuing 4-year degrees in some cases, right, but doing other things. So that is a definite problem, right, once we get past the tiny little elite. The second is that given all the upsides of integration and mixing people up, there are huge downsides, which is the students and people in society do see these glaring disparities. They do have consequences. The fact is that when we elevate people beyond their abilities, and here we are talking about cognitive abilities, we are forced to engage in duplicitous behavior. We are forced to lie about people's actual comparative talents. What happens in the real world is a lot of these people who are elevated beyond the level that they would ordinarily be hired in or the kinds of organizations they would ordinarily be working in are marginalized or pushed to the side. It creates a lot of whispering behind closed doors. In some ways, it reinforces stereotypes. Now, I think what's really going on is, do we want to engage in long-term thinking or short-term thinking?
Again, Amy, let me interrupt. Because,
I talked about this last time with medicine.
Yeah, and that's why I'm interrupting. There is nothing more sensitive than, it seems to me, really nothing at all on the race front than talking about differences in the abilities or the intellectual and cognitive development of people by race. I'm going to say here something that a lot of people don't want to hear me say, which is that those differences exist, they're real, and they're consequential. I want to be clear, for my part, that I don't believe that they are genetic or intrinsic to the people in virtue of the group that they belong to. I believe that they reflect developmental disparities where from the moment of birth going forward, the cognitive development of people depends upon their social location, and race is a factor in that. I'm not here to debate nurture and nature, okay? People immediately collapse the question of do these disparities exist and do they have consequences with, oh, now you have a theory about genetic inferiority. No, I agree. That's what I'm doing. Just give me a moment to make the point, okay? I wanted to go on the record for my own sake. You've just gone on the record for your sake. You're not making a nature versus nurture argument. You're not saying it's nature. You're just saying the differences are there and they're consequential. Here's what I'm trying to get at. It is hypersensitive. Okay, you said something that I think is true, which is that the standards that we have for judging people across the board can be undermined and subverted by the fact that we don't want to look in the face the reality of the consequences of admitting people broadly with different qualifications by race who then perform differently once we've admitted them in virtue of the fact that they have different qualifications by race. Those disparities get papered over and covered up. You said, and I agree with you, that there are whispers behind the scenes where people know so-and-so might not be quite up to snuff or whatever. And yet they don't want to say it publicly because it's verboten, it's politically incorrect. It's unacceptable to say it publicly, but we're confronted constantly with this kind of reality. A mediocre person having risen to their Peter Principle level of incompetency, but protected by the fact that they belong to one of these groups that are being underrepresented, quote unquote, and nobody can say anything about it. This is true and this is a reality. And here's what I'm trying to get at, and I'm sorry to take so long. There's a powerful shame that accompanies that because, you know, the minorities also know the truth of what you're saying. Many of them / us do. It's profoundly disquieting, uncomfortable, disconcerting, humiliating. Okay? And so the fury, so for example, when you came on the Glenn show some months ago and you made your comments about the performance of law students at the University of Pennsylvania, for which you took a lot of grief, I can't help but think that some of the impetus behind the fury of that response, at least from people of color, had to do with the humiliation of harboring within their own minds the knowledge that, well, you know, there might be something to it. You think somebody in the bottom of their class doesn't know they're in the bottom of their class?
I think there's so much self-delusion at this point. Glenn, I think there are two ways we can approach. I agree with everything you say, and I understand the sort of freighted emotional nature of all of this. I think we can think about it differently, but I think in our society right now, we're so far from thinking about it.
And therefore, we have to be careful what we say about it.
Of course. But let me say two things. All right. The first is, there is so much self-delusion and so much complicity in the self-delusion here, and it's gotten quite aggressive, where people who actually want to talk about the facts get punished at this point, very severely punished, that it's very hard to go back from that and think straight about these problems. But let's go back to square one. Why is there all this emotional and social capital expended on pushing affirmative action? Why do we even need affirmative action? In this diverse society that we have, in order to create diversity and, you know, a sort of rainbow of people, we shouldn't need affirmative action at all. There is one and only one reason that we need it, Glenn. It is the elephant in the room. It's because blacks continue to lag educationally. And in terms of qualification, I don't even want to use the word ability because that implies something intrinsic, right? I'm willing to go with the theory that it's all cultural, it's all behavioral, it has rooted in family structure or poverty or whatever it is, doesn't matter because of that fact. And that is the fact that, you know, people don't want to talk about, and yet it drives the whole establishment.
Well, it does matter. It does matter what the source of it is, because somebody out there is going to say it's rooted in a legacy of white supremacy. It's rooted in
whatever it is. But what is the solution? I'm just going to talk about long versus short term.
So you have a process that begins at birth and that terminates, let's say, when people are applying to law school. Okay, and you've got a lot of stages in between. If you try to remedy the developmental performance qualification disparity at the end point of that process, you don't have a whole lot of leverage and a whole lot of ability to do very much except paper it over. You need to intervene earlier. Affirmative action turns out not to be a very effective remedy for what is a problem that should attract social attention, namely protracted and deep differences in the acquired capacities to function cognitively between different racial groups. That's bad for America. It is at some level a problem of fairness or justice. I don't want to get into a philosophical debate, but it's a moral problem. That's all I'm trying to say. We can't sleep quietly and well at night, can we, knowing that that problem is festering and that it's going to be carried on from one generation to the next. We need to intervene earlier and forcefully. I don't say necessarily by race. I don't say that the intervention in early childhood education, in nurse home visitation, in enhanced school programs, in reform of public education that gets more effective teaching and school services delivered to youngsters, in summer programs, in mentorships and tutoring. I mean, you know, I can go on in this vein. You see what I'm getting at?
I do, but I think we make horrible mistakes here because we absolutely pick up the wrong end of a stick. We start at the end, right, saying, well, why aren't there more blacks in Silicon Valley? Why aren't there more blacks in academic medicine or in high-level law? When, in fact, of course, that's way too little too late. And then we bang people over the head, with it. We put all of this social capital behind it. But there's something new, Glenn, which is, and I've detected it over the past 5 years, a push to just deny the very differences that justify affirmative action. I mean, that's really cuckoo. I mean, that's completely incoherent. We punish people who dare to notice that there are these differences. And the kind of, behind closed doors muttering that it produces can be dramatic. So a person who will go nameless just said to me the other day, I know a lot of people, once again, as I've said, in academic medicine, this person said, knowing what I know, I'd never go to a black oncologist, right? Now think about that kind of statement. I mean, people make those statements. I hear that sort of thing. It's muttered, it's whispered, it's secret, or it's not even spoken at all. People see the great extent to which the more demanding the field, the more affirmative action there is. Now, let me just say for the record, and this is relevant to the Asian American case, that cognitive ability is not the only thing that matters, but it does matter a lot, and it matters much more in some fields than in others. It matters, unfortunately, in many of the most rewarding fields. It varies quite a bit. The harm from pushing people much further than they would go under their own steam varies from field to field. So it's not a simple matter, okay? But going back to the Asian Americans, I do want to say this. Given what the court said in Grutter about diversity and the value of diversity and how we're going to defer to the experts on diversity in the pedagogical sphere, I think that the Asians have a very tough uphill battle in winning their case, because in saying that, and I don't know that O'Connor even knew what she was doing and what the ramifications were, the court handed educational institutions an enormous carte blanche. I mean, they really gave them an enormous amount of leeway to decide how they were going to do admissions and how they were going to compose the class. And, as a friend of mine said, the SATs is not incorporated into the Equal Protection Clause, nor is it incorporated into the anti-discrimination laws that apply to private universities. I mean, one big difference here is that Harvard is a private university. All the prior affirmative action cases, the big ones, Fisher, Grutter, and the like, all involve public universities and the Equal Protection Clause. So there's another question looming in this case, which is, what is the standard under Title VI, which is the statutory provision under the spending power that limits and controls what Harvard can do, right? The Constitution does not forbid affirmative action by private institutions. So that's a whole nother legal question in this case. But, what are the Asian Americans have a few possible arguments that they can use.
Hold on. I just want to pause for a moment. I definitely want to go on to what the arguments are. But I want to, first of all, underscore this point that you just made. You may have a right to be treated equally, but you don't have a right to be judged by a particular set of criteria.
Correct.
And the latitude there is really quite enormous. I've actually read the economics experts' briefs on both sides of this pending Harvard case with the Asians. There's an economist at UC Berkeley, very distinguished, named David Card. And there's an economist at Duke, also distinguished, named Peter Arcia-Decano. And basically, Arcia-Decano is representing the plaintiffs. He's a expert witness for the Asian students who are suing. He finds that when you estimate the likelihood of being admitted and you control for academic qualifications, the Asians have a significantly lower probability with the same qualifications of being admitted than white students or black students or Latino students at Harvard. I mean, it's big. The gap is big.
Well, the purely numbers-based academic qualifications.
That's what I'm saying. You control for academic qualifications. Now, on the other side, David Card, the expert witness, answers. He says, Arcia-Decano accuses Harvard of discriminating because Harvard doesn't have the criteria of admissions that he wishes they had. He thinks that they should only have academic characteristics as the part of the admissions. But as a matter of fact, they have personality and academic characteristics.
Well, anything you can think of, right?
Well-rounded people. Where have we heard that before?
Life experience.
Princeton in the early 20th century. They're interested in leadership. They're interested in people who are nice. attractive, interesting. Okay, so now
social justice warriors, or people who've overcome adversity, or people who've come from different places or different backgrounds, or single parent families, or I mean, the list is endless, right?
So they have a personality index that enters into their formula for evaluating students, on which Asians, surprise, surprise, tend to perform poorly relative to other groups. And the defendant's expert witness says when we take these personality characteristics into account, there really isn't much difference between the likelihood of an Asian applicant and a non-Asian applicant getting admitted. And now the debate becomes about whether or not those additional variables are legitimately taken into account.
Correct.
The reason I intervene here is because I want to get your expert legal opinion about the question because after all, about the question of which criteria are you able to use to constitute your class. Because after all, you can invent criteria. If you started out with the goal simply of wanting to discriminate against Asians, but we're trying to cover yourself by saying, oh, no, it's not that they're Asian, it's that they have poor personalities, there's always going to be some way of cooking the books such that you get the result that you want, and then you stand back and you say, well, I wasn't caring about their Asianness, I was caring about their well-roundedness. So does the law speak at all to this question? Because it seems very important to me.
Well, I'm going to give the short answer, which is, as the law stands now, no, it does not definitively resolve this, Glenn, because given the discretion that Grutter recognized for admissions to create, a diverse class with lots of different attributes, you are comparing apples and oranges. How do you set off a high SAT against, compelling personality, leadership ability, diverse experience, overcoming adversity? I mean, you're really comparing radically different things. It's a little weird that all the people with the super high scores are mostly Asian, and the people who are strong on the other attributes come from other groups, but hey, that's Harvard's decision and its infinite wisdom of how they're going to comprise that class. So once again, there is no legal rule that one must use purely academic measures. One must use SATs. One must use grades. That's the obstacle that the Asian Americans need to overcome. Now, just how could the Asians make an argument that would try to circumvent all of the discretion that is handed to these schools by the court? One way is to go back to Grutter and look at Kennedy's opinion. So Kennedy in Grutter wrote a concurrence in which he said something like this. He said, okay, diversity, pedagogical values through diversity are important, but we can't just take the word for these educrats that it is important. Because we're dealing with race-based decision-making, which is highly suspect under our system, the administrators need to demonstrate the educational benefit, they need to identify it, and they have the burden of proof to show that people who go to these schools are better off because of this so-called diversity. Now, what would that proof look like?
Meaning the white people and the Asian people, as well as the black people and the Latino people.
It can't just be say-so. I mean, you can't just sort of pronounce it. I mean, I'm reading now a little bit into what he says, but you need to give us something concrete. Very high hurdle here.
And what happened to that?
Well, what happened to that hurdle is that the hurdle was lowered. And it was lowered in a case called Fisher involving the University of Texas in the 2000 teens, where the lower court effectively did put the screws on Texas and say, hey, you haven't shown us that you need your race-based program, especially since they had this 10% program, which was already getting them a lot of diversity, 10% off the top of every high school. So they had a race-based program that was giving them a little more diversity. I said, that's not good enough, doesn't satisfy compelling interest. You haven't shown an added benefit. It was actually not a very good case for Texas for affirmative action. Case went up to the Supreme Court. They said, yeah, there needs to be a demonstration, some kind of demonstration. Lower court looked at the facts, they said, well, you know, they pronounced, they had a laundry list of the supposed benefits, dispelling stereotypes, preparing people for a diverse society, you know, the usual pablum, Glenn, the usual pablum, but no real data or pseudo data, right? And the Supreme Court said, that's enough. Essentially, if you cobble together a fairly superficial case, it sounds good. For the benefits of diversity, the courts are going to give you a pass. Now, what didn't happen is anybody with an interest to come in or didn't do a very good job of, well, it may dispel stereotypes, but it can also reinforce stereotypes. You know, it may prepare you for a diverse society, but it also brings into stark relief the ways in which the profiles, the talent profiles of all groups don't coincide perfectly. You know, I mean, there are downsides as well as upsides to being up close and personal with the fact that all groups are not equal.
So it's an empirical question. It's an empirical question that has never actually been tested.
Correct. It's never been rigorously tested.
Interesting. Okay, we've had a brief tour of the legal jurisprudence landscape on affirmative action from Bakke to Grutter to Fisher. And I want us to use the rest of our time here to talk about the elephant in the room. You were speaking about elephants in the room. My God, Supreme Court appointment of Brett Kavanaugh hanging in the balance even as we speak. Sexual misconduct allegations being bandied about. The political firestorm that's ensued. The issue of journalistic standards about stories that have been read. Disquieting, at least to this American, I'm talking for myself, a sense that something that a person did in their adolescence 35 years ago would be brought to bear as a, kind of criterion of judgment about their fitness for high office and things of this kind. And I just want you to weigh in a little bit on all of that.
And what else, Glenn?
You are a woman and I'm a man. Senator Hirono has told me to shut up. She says, shut up and step up. I don't even know what to do now. But parse this Me Too moment at the U.S. Supreme Court.
I mean, here's the problem is that everything's connected to everything else when it comes to Me Too, right? I mean, there are so many different ways into talking about this. I guess my take on it, I mean, I have, rather realistic, traditional views about the relations of men and women. I mean, I think, the original sin here is this conceit, this crazy idea, which comes out of the 60s and radical feminists have taken up, men have taken up too, because it serves their purposes, that there is one sexuality, and that sexuality is male. And of course, that idea is behind the hookup culture, which I think has been in many respects disastrous and produced an enormous amount of unhappiness and the like. And it's also produced an enormous amount of libertine behavior and delusional thinking on the part of both men and women. So,
Wait a minute, are you blaming women for the fact that men act like pigs? How did Michelle Goldberg?
No, I am not blaming women, but I am sort of blaming radical feminists, not for the fact that men act like pigs, but for burning to the ground all of the norms, constraints, and conventions, albeit imperfect, that were in place to help to control and tame male behavior as well as female behavior, and these are collective action problems. Okay, here's what I learned when I went off to college. My mother never said this in so many words, but I knew it. Men propose and women dispose. Okay, now what does that mean? Right? It means, to quote Mark Regnerus, that men will always have a higher and more relentless demand for sex than women are willing to supply. So we have this kind of standing mismatch between supply and demand. And
can I just observe, I don't mean to interrupt you, Amy, but just very quickly, there's a powerful evolutionary biological argument on behalf of this men propose women. Because, I want my genes to propagate, and I've got a lot of sperm, so I want to spread them as much as I can. The woman is going to be stuck with the consequence of being impregnated and have to actually deal with that.
Right.
She's going to dispose. Of course, the guy's going to propose if the goal is to propagate your genes. And so
Right.
I don't mean to sound like Jordan Peterson or something. I can hear him saying this right now.
Why not?
But I think it happens to be true. He's not wrong about everything, okay?
It's right about some things. Well, what is the implication of this for me, too? I mean, it's very complicated. So here are a couple of thoughts, and then I'll talk about Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
One is that women, to some extent, are going to have to act as gatekeepers. Now, when you say the term, when you use the word gatekeeper with feminists, they just go berserk, right? No, we don't want to be gatekeepers. We don't want to be the firewall, the rate limiting step. We don't want to have to deal with these proposals and these propositions and, men trying to kiss us and men propositioning us and all of this sort of thing. We don't want to deal with male sexual initiative. They make out like it's some kind of horrible life-changing trauma, which I think is just complete exaggeration for effect, and I can address why I think they are invested in that. Okay, because that's a burdensome, oppressive role for us to take, and concomitantly, men should just learn to stop. Asking. I mean, they need to read our mind and figure out when the sex is wanted, and then they can ask, but no unwanted requests and all that. Now, of course, this is all pie in the sky fantasy. Try creating a system like this.
Hold on. What about hostile environment? I mean, what about the idea that a woman comes to work and her actual ability to function is impeded by the fact that the guy is hitting on her? Okay,
well, let me just carve out workplace, because I am convinced that we should have pretty strict rules for the workplace. I mean, a lot of what Me Too is about is just egregious behavior, which should never occur. We can all agree on what the rules should be, right? That men in superior positions shouldn't be hitting on women in inferior positions, and I think that's been a positive outcome. But unfortunately, Me Too has bled over into, adolescent party behavior. Yeah. What's written in the yearbook about a woman that probably was regarded as a slut, right? As breaking the rules of proper female behavior. I mean, there's so many different manifestations now of this other than the narrow one of let women do their work and not have to deal with, superiors hitting on them with the specter of quid pro quo. There's a core, I think, that everybody agrees on.
Do you think that, excuse me, but on this, do you think Alex Kaczynski was properly driven off of the Ninth Circuit bench by...
Well, see, I think that's a tough call. That, I know Alex, he's a friend of mine, yeah. Okay? He's been known to proposition many women, not his inferiors. He's a little bit polymorphous perverse, but he's also a very brilliant jurist. My personal view, Glenn, because I'm 65 years old and I came of age at another time and I've worked in highly male workplace environments and I've had to break into those environments, is, okay, he shows you a pornographic picture. You're his law clerk. He shouldn't do it. It's not professional behavior. It violates certain standards. It's not a good idea, but do we have to have this fire hose all or none approach to every single infraction, to every falling short of the standards? Can we not have a more nuanced, graduated response to it? This is not rape. This is not sexual assault. This is not some awful illegal thing. Let's think about how we are going to respond to this. There's another aspect to it that I do want to address, sure. Which is this insistence that feminist Me Tooers have that every single one of these experiences is a horrible, destructive, life-changing trauma. Having a guy put his hand on your leg, being shown an off-color picture by your judge. This is just something that, you have to go into 20 sessions of therapy for. This paints a picture of women. It's the harm principle, right? We always have to have recourse to the harm principle. They're doing terrible harm. This paints a picture of women as these incredibly fragile, vulnerable creatures you have to seriously ask, how are they going to function in the real world? Now, why do they always have this fire hose full force response? I have a theory. Because they don't have the cultural confidence to put forward a gentlemanly code, a kind of supererogatory code of good behavior, without claiming that every instance of violation is an assault on a particular woman. Now, it isn't, okay? I'm sorry. That's not true. Gentlemanly codes are worth endorsing. They're worth having. They're worth embracing in our society because systemically and in the aggregate, they make for a better society. They make life better for women. But it doesn't follow that every bit of ungentlemanly behavior, right, is some hideously destructive trauma. And I think it makes women look silly to say that. Every woman has had some kind of unwanted kiss or overture or some such. I have. Okay, I can tell you, Glenn, I have not been traumatized for life by the few cases in which a man has tried to kiss me and I wasn't really interested in him, or, I know this is going to sound shocking, a friend of my father's trying to kiss me when I was 15 years old. All right? You know, did I have to go into therapy for 10 decades for that? No, I just thought, I read
Dahlia Lithwack's piece, the journalist. I think she writes for Slate. I might get that wrong, but Slate or Salon or something. She was a clerk at the Ninth Circuit, not for Kaczynski, but for another one of the judges.
Right.
But she had a relationship with Kaczynski, and she describes at great length, the repeated instances in which, you know, he would kiss her with a kiss that lingered too long. He called her home once, or her husband answered, and he described himself as her paramour.
Who is this?
This is
Kaczynski?
Dahlia.
Well, Dahlia Lithwick claimed this about Kaczynski?
Yes. Yes, she wrote a long piece for her magazine in which she was basically beating up on herself for having put up with it. She says, I'm a 50-year-old woman now, at the top of my game as a journalist, and I'm still collaborating in the conspiracy of silence amongst we women who, you know, knew that the guy was boorish, that the guy was over the line, that the guy was who he was. But we put up with it because we wanted to get ahead, because he was powerful, because we didn't want to be the one to be, you know, the only one that was making a stink about it, or whatever. I can't recapitulate her argument. But the main point I'm trying to make by mentioning her is that I take your point. I mean, there's an infantilization of women, is there not, to think that somebody putting a hand on a knee is going to send her to therapy. On the other hand, to be embedded in a system or an institution in which this kind of behavior by some men becomes habituated and it kind of becomes a part of the environment, and now you know it's got to be very unpleasant and more. And so some of the energy behind this Me Too has got to be just simply this, not one-off instances, but the kind of insidious character of this sort of culture of prerogative and presumption that men presume and then exercise their presumed prerogative in ways that diminish the dignity of a woman. How's she going to possibly be equal in an environment where this kind of behavior is going on?
Okay, well, I think Alex Kaczynski is a good example, right? Because it is this kind of low-level, you know, self-indulgent sexualization that he was engaging in.
Yeah.
We really need to ask ourselves, you know, a few things. First of all, how can women handle this kind of behavior in a way that disciplines it, right? What are the options there for a kind of low-level guerrilla warfare that counters the low-level guerrilla warfare that is being launched against you? The second question, and I really seriously mean this, is, you know, what is the nature of the harm, as annoying as it is, and as kind of childish as it is, and self-indulgent as Kaczynski could be? And I'm kind of being a little negative here about him, even though he is a good friend of mine. He continues to be a friend of mine. And, you know, I've been a little bit of the target of some of this. What real harm is it doing? It's an annoyance. It's an irritant. But in what way, if he doesn't otherwise visit consequences on these women, and he's advanced many of these women's careers and been a real supporter and a help, what is the nature of the harm here? I mean, think about it. Men put up with that kind of crap all the time. I mean, what we keep forgetting is, you know, there's sexual abuse, and then there's just abuse. There's just abuse. Yeah. I mean, and there's a double standard. I mean, going back to Kavanaugh, you know, men engage in this kind of physical rough and tumble all the time. I thought men and women were the same. You know, why is it all of a sudden when a guy gets on top of a girl, which he shouldn't do, all right, and let's be very clear, we should teach our sons, don't do that, right? Why is that worse, putting his hand over her mouth, oh, he was going to rape her? I find that very implausible and kind of manufactured, and how can we know?
Well, by the way, he denies it.
For men, this is fine.
Want to say, excuse me, Amy, he denies it all. He says it didn't.
I understand that. I'm not saying he did it. I think we have to be I have to be agnostic about did it happen, right? Okay. We have no way of knowing. That's a very important point to make. This believe the accuser thing, that just demolishes our entire system of fair play that we've developed over hundreds of years. It burns it to the ground, Glenn. I don't know what these women think they're going to put in its place. They don't think, all right? They don't think systemically about it. I
agree with that, but I'm just on your point. Even if he did it, you want
right. We don't know if he did it, but even if he did it, right? So we have to sort of think in a tree branch type of way. What responses would we have? I think there's no way to know whether he did it. I think it's a stale allegation. I think it violates principles of basic fair play for her to be bringing this up. I think she should have held her tongue. If I were her, I would have. I think basic dignity and fairness dictates that, you know, it's too late, Ms. Ford. Even if there would have been consequences to bitching about it at the time. So there's that. But even if he did it, 17 years old, we now are saying that a man is going to pay for the rest of his life for a momentary act of, you know, recklessness, which didn't leave any permanent, you know, didn't create any permanent harm except through this manufactured idea that this is such a horrible, traumatic thing. It's not a good thing. But honestly, you know, the woman is not going to recover from that. And his whole life now is ruined. Now, I just think on balance with the trade-offs, and there always will be trade-offs, Glenn. There will always be trade-offs. There's no perfect justice, right? That this is not fair.
Okay.
And here's the other thing that I object to about this whole Me Too absolutism. These radical I hate to beat on radical feminists, but I have to because they're so stupid in so many ways, right? They have this childish idea of perfect justice. We are going to find a system that gives us perfect justice. There is no such system, right? We either have a presumption of innocence just as a norm, a social norm, a legal standard, and that means that certain people who are guilty will go free, or we have a system where the mere accusation, right, is an indictment and a conviction. Why even bother having a hearing if we have to believe all the victims, right? Why even bother going through this charade? A woman comes forward, she says whatever, and that's it. He's done. Now, you know and I know that we do not want to live under that kind of system. We've spent 1,000 years getting away from the Star Chamber, trial by ordeal, you know, all the stupidities of a primitive legal system. And people all over the world want to come to our countries. This is another statement that will get you into trouble. The Anglo-American system is a city on a hill. It's a shining example to the rest of the world. they suffer every day from not having.
That's true, and the institutions are so important. And
yet the feminists want to burn all this to the ground. They really, really do, and start from scratch. And what are they going to put in its place?
It's a Republican Supreme Court justice who's a Catholic and a conservative today. It'll be a Democrat tomorrow. It's a man today.
But they've already said they're going to apply a different standard to a Democrat.
It'll be a woman tomorrow. I mean, it is a slash and burn kind of activity that's going on. I would imagine motivated by political animus. I mean, the Merrick Garland problem, Democrats very angry about that. The concerns about Roe versus Wade being overturned, and people are very much up in arms about that. But
these are emotional displacements, and all the cliches about women being hyper emotional, about not being able to step back and think systemically and analytically. And
I'm a man.
In evidence here.
I have to speak up for the guys to this extent. Okay, I read Michelle Goldberg's column in the New York Times this morning. It's entitled "Pay All the Way Down." Okay, and she's talking about the fraternity that Kavanaugh belonged to at Yale, Delta Kappa Epsilon, that has a reputation for being misogynistic. She's talking about the fact that he belonged to a secret society. She's saying, I'm reading reports about, like you say, what's in the yearbook at high school. I'm reading that he was a protege of Kozinski, and Kozinski has had to step down to sexual misbehavior. What did he know, and when did he know it about? This is guilt by association beyond any belief. It's a star chamber situation. It's out of hand, frankly, and we're going to live to regret it if it prevails, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, no, once again, basic notions of fair play, guilt by association, slurs and smears. I mean, there's no depth to which they will not go. And there's another aspect to this, Glenn, which is lefties are the ones who say that once, that we shouldn't hold 17-year-old crimes and misdemeanors against kids. We should have forgiveness. We should have rehabilitation. Employers shouldn't know that someone's been convicted of theft or assault. They should hire them anyway. I mean, they're the ones who are always talking about how people grow up, they develop, they improve, they rehabilitate themselves, and now they're just turning around and saying, none of this is possible.
Ban the box. Ban the box.
Ban the box. Right, ban the box.
Don't ban the mistakes that a young man made when he was 21 years old. Keep him from getting a job when he's 40.
Can't hold it against him forever.
Yeah.
But that's, what they'll say is, well, our identity politics kicks in here.
Well, let me ask you this, Amy. What about journalism? I mean, I read the following in the newspaper and I couldn't believe it. So Kavanaugh says on Fox News when he was interviewed that he was a virgin until after college.
Which is so embarrassing that he would have to say that.
Somebody goes back and finds a classmate at Yale who says, well, that's not what and they print this in the newspaper. That's not what he told me.
Oh, God.
Okay? And I'm thinking, if I were a guy in one of these fraternities at Yale and somebody asked me if I had ever been with a woman before, I'd lie and say, sure, I had, even if I hadn't, because I wouldn't want to be so square. But I'm wondering, why am I reading this in the newspaper in the year 2018? That's unbelievable. And I must say, the New Yorker's publication of this story about Ramirez, they had no foundation whatsoever for the claim except her word. They couldn't verify it by any contemporaneous person involved in the supposed events. The New York Times turned the story down. They wouldn't print it, and they don't want to see it.
They did today print it, and they found someone who didn't so much say, I remember it, as I believe her. Well, I believe her is not a piece of evidence, okay? She initially said, I'm not sure it was Kavanaugh. I'm not sure it even happened. I have a hazy, I mean, her story was so flimsy, I don't think it's beneath attention. But no, they're blowing it up into something as if it's, actually happened and it's true. I don't know what the lowest point is here. To me, the lowest point was when Kavanaugh had to talk about how long he was a virgin, as if that was relevant. I'm embarrassed. I'm bummed out, is what I am.
Yeah. What do you think is going to happen, Amy? Let's close out. We're over an hour here. What do you think is going to happen?
I don't know, because I don't like to think about it. I mean, here's my view. I mean, as a Republican, I guess they call it in name only these days, but that has a different meaning. I am looking to McConnell to save the day and just say, enough of this, okay?
Yeah, let's vote.
Let's hold the vote.
Yeah.
And if there were any party discipline, any at all, and of course that's on its last legs, he would go personally to each of the Republicans and say, you're voting for this guy.
Yeah.
Right? He'll make a great Supreme Court justice. He has a fantastic record. He has a wonderful record of supporting women. Whatever he did or didn't do when he's 17, and it's not like he raped the woman, you know, let's definitely be realistic about the magnitude of what he's claimed to have done. It just cannot outweigh what he has done since. We need to balance, as Heather McDonald says in her piece that you sent me, right? We need to balance off the pros and the cons, and on balance, this man is good for us, and he's good for America, and we need to vote for him. That is what I'm hoping for. And now whether that will happen, I don't know.
We're going to find out. But Amy Wax, thank you very much for your candid contribution to the game show. I think the responses are likely to be interesting. Keep your eye on the comment section.
Oh, yeah, really?
And blogging at TV. But I really appreciate talking to you, Amy. So
I can't wait for the comments.
Signing off here.